Hello and welcome to Sunset Zen and Sleepy Stories. Please relax, listen, and enjoy. The Slow Work of Water, a fourth story from Heron Inlet. An unhurried account of one Sylvie, one Edwin, the February coast, and the particular mercy of being somewhere that does not require anything of you. February on the coast of the Pacific Northwest is not a month for the faint of heart, and yet it is not a cruel month either. It is simply an honest one. The storms come in from the southwest with a kind of professional consistency, one after another, each one spending 3 or 4 days reorganizing the shore and the forest and the character of the light before giving way to a brief interval of stillness, a day, sometimes 2, during which the world has washed away in exhausted clarity. Everything very clean and very quiet, the puddles in the lane reflecting the sky, and the bare alder branches holding their catkins in long, pale clusters, like something between a question and a promise. And then the next storm comes in over the horizon, dark-bellied and purposeful, and the whole conversation begins again. The animals know it well by now. The herons stand in the inlet's shallow, through the worst of the rain, with a patience that is not resignation, but something more like perfect acceptance, their long necks tucked, their gray plumage shedding the water in sheets, their yellow eyes half-lidded and calm, waiting for the particular quieting of the water that signals a fish moving in the shallows below the surface. And the harbor seals haul out on the sandbar at low tide and sleep in their boneless, abandoned ways, their spotted gray bodies arranged at every angle, entirely unconcerned with anything. The ravens work the beach after every storm, moving through the wrack with an air of dark intelligence and mild satisfaction, turning things over, finding what has been left behind. Marin had learned February long ago. She kept the fire banked higher this month, drew the curtains on the west-facing windows only on the worst nights when the rain came sideways and the draught crept in around the old glass and cooked longer, lower, and richer than in other months, because February called for it, for stews with bones in them, for bread that required warmth and more time, for soups that began with a sofrito and ended 3 hours later with something deep and irreducible. She kept the teapot warm all day. She made sure there were candles. She had been keeping February at Heron Inlet for 23 years, and she understood what it asked of you and what it offered in return, which were not always the same thing, and were always worth it. Sylvie came first, on a Sunday evening when the rain was moderate and the light had already left the sky by 4 o'clock, which in February it does without apology. She was 44 years old and had the particular quality of someone who has been taking care of other people for a very long time. Not carelessly, but at some cost to whatever she had been taking care of before she turned her full attention outward. She was a nurse, or had been, before she had taken a leave she could not quite call a leave, and could not quite call a collapse, although it had elements of both. She had been home for 6 weeks. She had spent most of those weeks being quietly and carefully all right, which was exhausting in its own way. And her sister had booked this for her and handed her the printed confirmation and said simply, firmly, with the tone of someone who has run out of gentle options, "Go." She had driven up in the rain with a radio off and had cried for part of it, not from any particular grief, but from the accumulated pressure of 6 weeks of being quietly and carefully all right, and had stopped crying somewhere in the trees north of the city, and had felt afterwards lighter in a specific way of a vessel that has been overfull for too long and has finally been allowed to spill. Marin met her on the porch in the rain. She took Sylvie's bag and her coat, and she looked at her, not assessingly, not clinically, just looked with the full and uncomplicated attention she gave to everything. And she said, "You made it." 2 words that managed to mean exactly the right thing, which was not simply that she had navigated the lane in the dark, but that she had gotten here, whatever here meant, however long it had taken. Inside, the house received her. The warmth, the fire, the smell of whatever was on the stove. Something with tomato and wine, something deeply savory she couldn't identify, and the low amber light of the lamps, the particular sound of the rain when you were inside looking out at it, rather than outside looking for shelter. She sat at the kitchen table, and Marin put a glass of red wine in front of her, deep and dark, a Tempranillo, she said, from a small vineyard in the Columbia Gorge, and sat across from her for a moment with her own glass, and they touched the rims together lightly and drank and did not say anything immediately, which was the correct beginning. Edwin arrived the following morning, in the interval between storms, when the sky had lifted and gone a peculiar pale green-gray that meant clearing. He was 68 years old, recently widowed for the 2nd time in his life, and he had the look of someone navigating the specific geography of a loss that is both new and also deeply familiar, which is in some ways harder than a grief with no precedent. His first wife had died of cancer when he was 41 and his children were young, and he had rebuilt his life, as people say, though the metaphor had always seemed incomplete to him. He had not rebuilt. He had grown new things in the ruin, which was different, which left the ruin intact underneath. His second wife, Ruth, had died in November, quickly, which everyone assured him was a mercy, and which he could not entirely agree with yet. Because quickly also meant without warning, without preparation, without the gradual letting go that is its own kind of gift. He had driven up from Olympia with a thermos of coffee and a library book on the passenger seat, and the specific intention of being somewhere that was not his house, which had too many of Ruth's things in it still, arranged in her arrangements, holding the shape of her absence like a mold holds the shape of what has been poured into it and then removed. He came in from the cold with a quiet, self-sufficient manner, and introduced himself to Sylvie, who was sitting at the kitchen table with her 2nd cup of coffee and a paperback, and to Marin, who was making bread, and he accepted a cup of tea and sat by the fire with his library book and read for an hour without speaking, which was what he needed and what the house offered without requiring any explanation. On that first shared morning, Marin made a breakfast of considerable simplicity and complete satisfaction. Thick slices of pain de campagne, a sourdough she kept going in a broad, shallow crock, different from the taller loaf of other weeks. This one flat and rustic and dark-crusted, toasted in the iron pan with a little butter until both sides were deep gold and smelled of the specific richness of good bread meeting good heat. Alongside a dish of ricotta she had made herself from goat's milk delivered weekly by the neighbor of the road, still slightly warm, mixed with honey from a local beekeeper and the zest of a lemon, and a few fresh thyme leaves from the top pot on the windowsill, which brightened it and gave it a faint herbal lift. Alongside that, a shallow bowl of blood oranges she had segmented by hand over bowl so that every drop of juice was saved. Their flesh the color of garnets, laid in their pooled juices with a few pomegranate seeds scattered over the top that caught the morning light like small dark rubies. Edwin ate slowly and looked at the blood oranges with the expression of someone encountering a detail they had not expected. "My wife liked blood oranges," he said, not sadly or not only sadly. "She always bought too many." Marin nodded once, not requiring elaboration, and refilled his tea. The second storm came in that afternoon, and the days that followed had the quality of suspension that serious rain creates, a softening of the boundaries between morning and afternoon, a general permission to be unconcerned with time's usual architecture. Without strong light, there were no long shadows to track the sun by, no particular brightness at midday to remind you that the day was at its height and therefore passing. There was simply the rain and the fire and whatever was cooking, and the light that came through the windows even and gray and entirely without urgency. Sylvie noticed this on the second day and found it, unexpectedly, one of the most restoring things she had experienced in months. She had spent 6 years in a hospital where time was the most important force in the room, where minutes mattered, where the clock was always present in the corner of her vision, where the shift changed and the medications were due and the next patient was waiting. And then she had spent 6 weeks at home trying to relax and finding that the habits of urgency persisted even in the absence of urgency. That her body still moved quickly through rooms, still checked the time without meaning to, still arranged the day into tasks and completions and forward motion. Here, the time did something different. It became material rather than currency, something to be in rather than something to spend. She noticed this at some point in the middle of the second day, when she realized she did not know what time it was, and did not feel any particular pull to find out. And she sat with this realization for a while, which itself took time that she did not count. She had been reading and walking when the rain allowed, and sitting by the fire with her hands around a cup, and watching the inlet through the kitchen window where it appeared and disappeared in the weather. She had been sleeping, heavily, dreamlessly, the way she had not slept in years, waking with the sense of having been completely absent in the best possible sense. Waking to find that her body had done something large and necessary in the dark without her knowledge or her assistance. She had been eating slowly, everything Marin put in front of her, which was always more than she thought she wanted, and exactly what she needed. On the second afternoon, she sat in the kitchen table while Marin made soup, and she did not read, and she did not write, and she did not look at her phone. She simply sat and watched Marin's hands moving through the ingredients, the garlic being minced, the leek being halved and washed in the stone sink, the carrots being sliced on the diagonal in the French way, and listening to the rain, and felt the warmth of the fire from the next room, and breathed slowly, with a fullness she had not been bringing to breathing for some time. Marin did not comment on this. She just cooked, moving through her kitchen in her patient way, and occasionally said something brief about what she was doing, that the leeks needed a long, slow cook, and that she had added a piece of Parmesan rind to the pot because it gave the broth depth that was worth the hour it took. And the information arrived in Sylvie's mind, not as an instruction, but as company, warm and specific and requiring nothing back. Edwin, meanwhile, had found the chairs in the library alcove, a small room off the main highway with 2 low armchairs and a window that looked onto the north side of the garden, and a set of shelves containing books of every kind in no particular order. Novels beside field guides, beside poetry collections, beside a very old encyclopedia with its gilt spine rubbed bare to cloth. He spent the mornings there, reading and watching the garden in the rain, the kale standing dark and stoic in its bed, the bare rose canes against the fence, making their thorned winter lattice. A fat Steller's jay moving through the scene with his blue-black magnificence and his loud proprietary opinions about everything. He had brought his library book, but found he was reading instead a collection of poetry he had pulled from the shelf without quite knowing why. An anthology, old, its pages slightly foxed, the kind of book that opens itself to a page and waits. The page it opened to was a poem about winter light on water, and he read it twice and then sat for a long time looking at the rain and thinking about Ruth and what she would have said about this place, which was that it was exactly right, because she had had an instinct for exactly right places, which had been one of the things about her. He did not avoid these thoughts. He had learned the first time that avoidance was simply postponement, that grief deferred, collected interest, and arrived later at a higher cost. He sat with the thoughts about Ruth in the alcove chair, with the rain on the window and the jay in the garden and the smell of Marin's soup from the kitchen. And the thoughts were painful and also simply true. And the room held both things without comment, which was all he asked of rooms at the moment. Between the second and third storms, there was a morning of such particular and fragile beauty that Sylvie woke to it with a sense of having been given something. The rain had stopped in the night, the wind had dropped, the sky was still overcast, but the clouds had risen high enough that there was a quality of light, diffuse and silver, that caught on the wet surfaces of everything. The gravel of the lane, the leaves of the salal, the dark bark of the hemlocks, the inlet in the middle distance, and it made the whole world luminous in a way that had nothing to do with sunshine, that was specific to this kind of February coastal morning, this particular combination of water and cloud and the silver light that lives inside both. She took the shore path before breakfast, in the boots and coat from the hooks by the door, carrying the thermos of coffee that had appeared on the counter as though it always did, which it did. The forest was dripping from all surfaces, every needle, every branch, every leaf of salal and Oregon grape, bearing its accumulation of the night's rain and releasing it in slow drops that fell through the lower air in a secondary rain, softer and more intermittent than the original. The trail was dark, the mosses on the nurse logs and the fallen branches and the sides of the bigger fir trees had gone an extraordinary green, the kind of saturated, impossible green that wet moss achieves after a sustained rain. Not the green of grass or leaves, but something deeper and older, a color that seemed to produce its own light from somewhere inside itself. She stopped at a fallen log, entirely covered in this moss, and crouched beside it and looked at it closely, the way she had not looked closely at anything in some time. Up close the moss was not one thing, but many, dozens of different species growing together in a community of textures, each one distinct. The cushion moss in round pillows of deep emerald, the feather moss spreading its branching fronds like the finest imaginable fernwork, a thread moss so delicate it seemed more like a mood than a plant, a liverwort lying flat against the log in dark overlapping scales. And among them, tiny and perfect, the miniature cups of the lichen she had no name for, each cup no longer than a pinhead, the edges just slightly flared, holding inside each one a single drop of water from the night's rain that caught the morning light and held it. 10,000 tiny lanterns lit from within. She stayed crouched there for several minutes, that required, which was longer than she had stayed with any single thing in recent memory, and the forest dripped around her, and the thermos of coffee was warm in her hand, and she thought, I used to be someone who looked at things like this. And then, I still am that person. She's just been occupied elsewhere. The trail came out on the beach, and the beach opened around her. The dark sand, the ocean, the broad silver light over everything. And she stood at the edge of the trees for a moment, just taking it in. The surf today was moderate, the swells coming in from the northwest in long, orderly lines, each one building to a clean break that ran the length of the beach in both directions in a moving white line, beautiful and exact. Between the sets there were intervals, near silence, when only the hiss of the retreating wave on the sand remained. And in those intervals the beach was very still, and the light was very even, and the whole scene had composed, considered quality, like a painting in which the painter understood restraint. She walked the beach for an hour, going north to the headland and back, and she stopped when things stopped her. A perfect sand dollar intact, which is rare. They usually arrived in fragments, the beach not being particularly gentle with delicate things. A pale beige, its surface patterned with the faint star of its living form, which she held in her palm for a moment and then set back on the sand near where she had found it. A cluster of goose barnacles on a piece of driftwood with their long fleshy stalks and white shells arranged in the tumbling abundance that made them look, to her nurse's eye, like something biological and interior, something that belonged inside a body rather than on a log at the end of a tide line. A great blue heron standing in the shallows 30 feet ahead of her on the beach, fishing, its neck pulled into its characteristic S-curve, its yellow eyes scanning the water with the total focused patience of something that has evolved over millions of years for exactly this and nothing else. She stood still and watched it. It did not move, except that one foot lifted and reset itself very slowly to a slightly different position, the way you shift your weight without deciding to. Then it struck, the neck uncoiling in a movement almost too fast for the eye, and came up with a small silver fish that it tossed back in its beak and swallowed in one long muscular movement of the throat. Then it returned to stillness, as though the eruption of speed and precision had never happened, as though it had been standing there undisturbed forever. Sylvie watched for a long time and then walked on, and when she looked back from 50 yards, the heron was still there, already in the exact same pose, already back to its waiting, which was not waiting at all, but the truest and most complete form of attention. That afternoon, Edwin went to the beach for the first time. He had been watching it from the house, from the alcove window and the kitchen window and the porch, but he had not gone down, for reasons he had not examined closely. He went in the afternoon, in the last of the brief, clear interval before the next storm, wearing his own coat, a good one, oilskin, old, and the boots from the rack by the door. The shore path through the forest was new to him, and he walked it slowly, reading it as he went. The large nurse log Sylvie had crouched beside, its moss vivid, the stand of young hemlock, and their lower branches gone to the shade, but their tops bright, reaching. The place where the trail dipped through a small draw and crossed a stream on a plank bridge. The stream running full and fast and very clear after the rain, its sound a rapid, cheerful thing after the deep patience of the ocean that was now audible ahead. He came out on the beach and stood at the edge of the trees, looked at the ocean for a long time. He had grown up inland, in the high desert of eastern Oregon, in the landscape of space and silence and wide sky, and the ocean was not his native element, not the thing he turned to instinctively. But Ruth had loved it. Ruth had been a coastal person in her soul, had spent her childhood on the Washington coast, had always said she needed the smell of salt air at intervals, the way other people need sleep. She had tried for years to bring him here, to this particular coast, and they had been about to come, in December, when the diagnosis arrived, and the December trip became something else entirely. He stood at the edge of the trees and looked at the ocean and thought, so this is what she meant. The surf came in and went out. A cormorant flew low along the waterline, its dark form skimming at the surface, and then rose and banked and settled on a rock at the headland, and spread its wings in the heraldic pose cormorants take, drying them in the air that was too damp for a quick drying, but making the gesture anyway. The light was going now, the brief afternoon silver shading into something more subdued. The clouds coming back from the southwest with their air freight of the next system. Edwin walked to the headland and stood on the rocks and looked at the water, which was very dark now, and moving with the increased energy of an approaching storm. The swells, longer and deeper, the spray at the rocks already beginning to rise higher with each wave. He was not sure what he felt standing there. Too much at once, perhaps, which was also what grief was. Too many frequencies simultaneously. The loss, and the love, and the anger at the quickness, and the gratitude for years, and the loneliness, and the beauty of the coast in the February light, all present at the same moment, all equally real, all demanding a hearing he could not quite give them all at once. He stood there until the first drops of the new rain reached him, and then he turned and walked back through the forest in the gathering dark, the trail darker under the trees, the mosses a dim, deep green, the dripping resumed. And when the house appeared at the end of the garden path, with its lit windows and its smoke, he felt something move in him that was not happiness exactly, but was in the neighborhood of warmth, and was, for now, enough. The third storm arrived that night and stayed for 2 full days. It was the most serious storm of Sylvie's stay. The rain genuinely hard, the wind bending the tops of the tallest firs in long arcing sweeps. The inlet gone nearly entirely to gray opacity. The world reduced to the house and its immediate surroundings, and the noise of weather doing its whole work. Maren cooked through all of it. She cooked the way she did everything, continuously at a pace entirely her own, with a quiet that was not the quiet of concentration, but of someone doing the thing their hands know best in a place they know completely. On the first storm morning she had made congee, which had been soaking since the night before. A short grain rice and a great deal of water with ginger and a piece of dried kombu, brought to a boil and then reduced to the barest simmer, left for 2 hours to coax the rice into releasing its starch fully, becoming something between porridge and broth, thick and silky and almost translucent. She served it in deep bowls with soft cooked egg at the center and a scattering of thinly sliced scallion and a small dish of sesame oil in the side, and another of this ginger soy she kept in a jar in the cold pantry. It was the food of getting well, Sylvie thought, eating it slowly, and felt the thought arrive with some complexity, that she was in fact getting well, and that this required accepting the condition preceding it, which was that she had not been well, which was something that she had been resisting in her quiet and carefully all right way for 6 weeks. In the late morning, Maren began a braise, a short rib, bone in, which she seasoned simply with salt and let come to room temperature while she heated the oil in a heavy Dutch oven until it shimmered. She browned the meat in silence, a long, patient browning, each surface given the full time it needed to develop its crust, which was dark and deeply caramelized and smelled of the complex sugars and proteins that browning produces, a smell so fundamentally savory that both Sylvie and Edwin, independently, looked up from what they were doing when it reached them. Then onions and carrots and celery in the fat left in the pot, stirred slowly and allowed to soften. Then tomato paste, stirred in and darkened. Then a full bottle of red wine. She poured it without measuring, with the ease of someone who has made this enough times to need no anchor. And the wine hissed against the pot pan, and immediately the kitchen changed and became something more complex and more adult. The fruit and tannin of the wine meeting the caramelized sugars of the meat and the vegetables, and producing something that was entirely new and entirely necessary on a February storm day. Then stock. Then the meat went back in, nestled in the liquid. Then the lid went on, and it went into the oven, low, to spend the next 3 hours becoming more itself than it had ever been. Sylvie drifted into the kitchen and sat at the counter on the tall stool and watched, and Marin, without comment, gave her a pile of parsley to pick the leaves from, which Sylvie did with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to working with her hands in small, detailed spaces. They worked in silence for a while, and the storm pressed at the windows, and the braise sent its slow signals from the oven, and the kitchen was warm. "How long have you been doing this?" Sylvie asked eventually. She did not mean the braise. 23 years this April, Marin said. She was making horseradish cream to serve with the short rib, grating fresh horseradish root at the counter with the focus of someone who has done this enough times to respect the horseradish and not crowd it. "I came here first as a guest, then the owner wanted to leave, and I wanted to stay." "Just like that?" "Not exactly like that," Marin said, a slight curve to her mouth, "but eventually." Sylvie picked parsley. "Do you ever want to leave?" Marin considered this in her measured way, scraping the grated horseradish into a bowl and settling the root down and wiping her hands. "Some years I think about it, in the worst of February sometimes." She looked out the window at the storm. "But I think about the guests who are coming rather than the guests who have left, and it passes." "The ones who are coming," Sylvie said. "You think about them before they arrive?" "I think about what they might need," Marin said, simply, and went back to her bowl. Sylvie held this. She thought about 6 years of nursing, of thinking about patients before their shifts, about the particular attentiveness that good care required, and what happened when it was given for too long without replenishment. She thought about the difference between Marin's kitchen and a hospital corridor, and also about the unexpected similarity. Both were places where people arrived diminished, and were through sustained attention. And whatever gifts the keeper of the space possessed, made somewhat more themselves. "That's what I used to do," she said, half to herself. Marin looked at her directly. "Used to?" "I'm on leave." "Ah." Marin folded the horseradish into the cream, tasted it, adjusted. "Rest then. The thinking about others will be there when you return to it." A pause. "It doesn't go away. That kind of attention, it's not a skill, it's a nature." Sylvie looked at the pile of picked parsley before her, its bright green smell on her fingers. She thought, a nature, and felt something small and stubborn in her chest loosen, just slightly, at the idea that what she was taking a leave from was not gone, but waiting, that she had not used it up, but set it down, that setting it down was not a failure, but an ordinary human need. Dinner that evening was the short rib, which had become, in its 3 hours in the oven, something almost impossibly tender, the meat pulling away from the bone at the lightest pressure, the braising liquid reduced to a glossy, complex sauce with a kind of depth that can only be built slowly over hours, through the alchemy of heat and time applied to good ingredients with patience. Marin served it over soft polenta enriched with butter and a sharp aged Comté. She grated it over the top so that it melted in a golden layer, and alongside a dish of gremolata, the bright, raw lift of lemon zest and parsley and garlic chopped together and scattered over the braised meat to cut through its richness and wake everything up. Edwin ate slowly and said very little, and looked at his plate between bites with an expression of complete and uncomplicated presence. When he had finished, he set down his fork and looked at Marin. "My wife would have wanted this recipe," he said. Marin smiled. "I'll write it down for you." He nodded. She collected recipes. She had 11 notebooks. They're all still on the shelf in the kitchen. I haven't been able to move them. Nobody said anything. The fire in the hearth adjusted itself with a small, settling sound. The storm moved hard at the south windows, and the house absorbed it, as it always did, with the deep equanimity of something built to endure. "That seems right," Sylvie said, eventually. "For now." Edwin looked at her. "Yes," he said, "for now." Marin had been quiet, listening with her peculiar quality of listening, and she rose and brought from the kitchen a small plate of things for the end of the meal. Dried figs from a jar, soft and dark, 3 kinds of small cheese she had arranged onto a piece of slate, a few walnuts, a spoonful of quince paste the color of amber. She set it on the table between them and sat back down and poured the last of the wine, and they sat there for a long time, the 3 of them, in the warmth and the light, while the storm did its large and indifferent work outside the walls. The storm broke on the 4th morning. Sylvie woke to a quality of light she had not yet seen here. A pale gold, thin and precise, coming through the west window at an angle that meant the sun was somewhere above the clouds, or the clouds had thinned enough to let a version of it through. She lay in the high bed and watched the light on the ceiling, which was moving slightly, the trees outside casting their branches and shadows in the breeze that came after storms. Always this particular breeze from the northwest, cold and clean-smelling. She dressed and went downstairs and found Edwin already at the table with his coffee and his face toward the window where the inlet was visible for the first time since his arrival. The water a pale green silver in the morning light, absolutely still now that the wind had settled into its post-storm murmur. The far shore's fir trees reflected in it with a precision that made the world look doubled and dreamed. On the near bank, 6 buffleheads, small round ducks with their improbable white cheek patches, the females brown and modest, the males with that unlikely gleaming white head, were moving through the shallows in their bobbing, busy way, diving and resurfacing and diving again, with a cheerfulness that seemed, in the February morning, genuinely generous. Marin made breakfast with the unhurried attention of someone who knew the day would be good and was not in any hurry to begin it, which was its own kind of wisdom. She made a frittata, a simple and deeply satisfying thing. Eggs beaten with a spoonful of creme fraiche and a handful of Comté grated fine, poured into the iron skillet over sauté of leek and roasted peppers, and a scattering of fresh thyme, cooked on the stovetop until just set around the edges, and then placed under the broiler for 2 minutes until it puffed on a golden top and still trembling slightly in the center. She served it in wedges with a simple salad of watercress dressed with lemon and olive oil, peppery and bright, and the last of the sourdough, toasted and buttered. They ate with the window light falling across the table and the buffleheads on the inlet and the new morning air drifting in when Marin opened the kitchen door briefly to check the state of the garden, letting in with it the smell of the post-storm coast, that particular freshness that is equal parts rain-washed forest and cold salt air, and something alive and growing that has been waiting for the storm to pass so it could continue its quiet business. They walked together that day, all three of them, Sylvie and Edwin, and for the first time Maren herself, who came along with an ease of someone stepping outside their own house, which is what it was, and the ease of someone who had walked this path so many times it had become part of her body. She wore the same barn boots and the long oilskin coat, and she walked at a pace slightly slower than her usual indoor pace, which was already unhurried, and she stopped when they stopped and named things when she was asked. The forest after the storm was extravagant. Everything that had been gray and dark during those 2 days of storm was now revealed in its full winter complexity. The mosses at their most saturated green, the lichen on the alders growing silver blue in the thin light, the fern fronds that had been beaten flat now slowly recovering, lifting themselves in increments too small to watch directly, but visible if you looked away and looked back. A large old fir had come down the storm, a tree 3 feet across, and it had fallen across the trail and been there long enough in past storms that a previous trail worker had cut through it. The cut faces of the log, white and freshly exposed by this storm's particular violence, the rings visible in the end grain. Maren stopped and counted silently, moving her lips silently, and said, 240 approximately, give or take. They stood and looked at the cut face of the 240-year-old tree. It was here before this country was a country, Edwin said, not pointedly, just as a fact he was absorbing. It was here before this was a state, Maren said, before there was a road, before there was a name for this inlet. Sylvie put her hand on the cut face of the log, on the rings, feeling the slight roughness of the grain. 240 rings, 240 winters, a 240-year accumulation of exactly this, the storms and the clearings and the slow green springs and the dry summers and the long wet autumns, all of it recorded in concentric circles so thin you could barely distinguish one from the next, each one a year of everything the tree had lived through and grown through and simply continued through, because that is what trees do, until one February when the storm was sufficient. She kept her hand on it for a moment, then they walked on, toward the sound of the ocean, which was gentler today and more regular. The long swells still arrived from the recent storm, but their energy diminished, arriving politely now, breaking cleanly, the sound of them a steady, even rhythm, like a slow and very large breathing. The beach was covered in the storm's largesse. New logs pushed high above the tide line, enormous and stripped and salt white. A long line of kelp and eelgrass and broken shells, and the occasional brilliant flash of glass float. Green, heavy, perfectly spherical, that had come from somewhere far off across the water, and arrived here after years of traveling at the mercy of currents and wind and the general indifference of the ocean to the destination. Maren picked up the glass float and turned it in her hands and set it in the pocket of her coat. She did this with a naturalness that suggested she had done it before, that there was a shelf or a windowsill somewhere in the house where these things ended up. The three of them walked the beach in the post-storm light, which had a quality Sylvie had not seen before. The low winter sun at last fully through the thinned clouds, striking the wet sand at an angle that made it look like hammered silver, and striking the face of the incoming waves from behind, so that each wave was briefly translucent at its crest, a deep green blue before it broke into white. The oyster catchers were out in numbers, their red bills working at the exposed rocks, their piping calls carrying down the beach in the cold air. A bald eagle circled high over the headland, turning in a wide, slow spiral on a thermal, its white head bright even at that distance. Edwin watched the eagle. Ruth would have written that down, he said. He said it with less heaviness than before, Sylvie thought, or perhaps the same heaviness held differently, carried with slightly less resistance. What did she write down? Sylvie asked. Everything, he said. She kept journals, 40 years of journals. Every bird she saw, every recipe she tried, every conversation she found interesting, what the light was like on particular days. He paused. She wrote down things I said, things I didn't even remember saying. They walked a few steps. You should read them, Sylvie said. I know, he said. Not yet, but I know. Marin said nothing. She walked between them and slightly ahead, and looked at the ocean with the expression of someone watching something they know well and find, each time, still worth watching. On the 5th morning, Marin taught Sylvie to make bread. This was not presented as a lesson or an offering or a therapeutic activity. It arose from the morning itself, from Sylvie being in the kitchen while Marin began the process, and watching with a kind of attention that asks, through its quality, to participate. Do you want to do the mixing? Marin asked, and the question was so simply put and so free of any weight that Sylvie simply said yes and moved to the counter, and Marin showed her how she started. The starter from its crock, which had been fed the night before and was now active and bubbling with a particular yeasty aliveness of something in the middle of its own patient work, and the flour, a mix of bread flour and whole wheat, in the proportions Marin gave by feel rather than by cup, the whole wheat adding its nuttiness and structure, and the water lukewarm, and the salt. Marin showed her the mix, the rough, shaggy thing it was first, barely dough, more like a conversation between flour and water that had not yet resolved into anything, and then the first fold, which was not a knead, but a gentle stretching and folding, 4 sides in succession, the dough slowly beginning to tighten and develop a quality of elasticity that Sylvie could feel in her hands, a resistance and a spring that had not been there before. Let it rest, Marin said. 30 minutes, then fold again. Sylvie covered the bowl with a cloth, and they sat with their coffee and waited, which was, she was coming to understand, a significant part of what bread asked of you. It asked time in the most immediate and personal way. Not your time given over to a task, but your time given over to waiting, to allowing the process to proceed at its own pace without any input from you except attention and patience. She found she did not mind this. She found, in fact, that she had missed it without knowing. The requirement to simply wait while something alive and slow did its own work. The folding happened 4 times in the morning, at intervals of 30 minutes, each fold revealing a dough that had changed, more extensible, more cohesive, developing the web of gluten that would hold the gas of fermentation later, that would give the bread its crumb structure and its chew and its particular character. Between folds, Sylvie sat at the table or stood at the window watching the inlet, or read a few pages of her book, and the intervals of waiting became a kind of rhythm to the morning, a punctuation of intentional return to the counter, and the bowl, and the slow becoming thing inside it. When the final shape was done, Marin guided her hands through it, the tension building on the outer surface of the round, the dough pulled towards itself in a way that was almost aesthetic, almost satisfying in the same way a well-made bed is satisfying, for reasons not entirely functional. It went into a linen-lined banneton, and then into the cold pantry for its long, slow, overnight proof. Tomorrow morning, Marin said. I'll still be here, Sylvie said, and then, surprised by a feeling that had arrived with the words, I'm glad. Marin dusted the flour from her hands and looked at Sylvie with her direct and uncalculating gaze. Good, she said, simply, and went back to whatever was next. That afternoon, Edwin found Maren in the library alcove reshuffling the books in some private order that made sense to her. And he sat in the second chair and watched her for a moment. She did not seem to mind being watched. "Do you believe in an afterlife?" he asked. It came out directly, with the directness of someone who has been turning a thing over for long enough that the edges are worn smooth, and it no longer requires a preamble. Maren considered a book, a field guide to Pacific shore birds, its spine worn, and placed it on the shelf. "I believe in continuation," she said. "Not necessarily of the self, but of what the self was made of." She moved to another book. The things that constituted Ruth, her care, her attention, her way of seeing, those don't end. They're in you. They're in everyone she was ever kind to. They continue to act in the world through everyone she formed. She paused. "I find that comforting, though. I understand it isn't the same thing." Edwin was quiet for a while, looking at the rain-washed garden through the window, the light failing now in its early February way, the kale very dark against the pale sky. "She made things grow," he said. "Not just her garden, everything she touched. She had the quality of," he searched, "of making things feel possible." "Then that quality," Maren said quietly, not turning from the shelves, "is still present in everyone it touched." She placed the last book, "including you." Edwin sat with this. Outside, the first fingers of the next system reached the garden, a few drops on the window, and then more. The rain returning with its February reliability. Inside, the library alcove held its warmth, and its books, and its two chairs, and the man sitting in one of them holding something large and heavy, with a slightly different grip than before. Sylvie's bread came out of the oven on the 6th morning, and the house filled with a smell so fundamentally good that Edwin came downstairs 10 minutes before he normally would, drawn without quite knowing why. The loaf was dark and round on the counter, the crust a deep mahogany scored in a pattern that had bloomed in the oven's heat into a design that was beautiful in the uncalculated way of things that happen between intention and process. Maren took it from the oven and set it on the wire rack and said, "Not yet, because the bread needs time after breaking. The interior is still finishing its work, the steam still escaping through the crumb, and this final waiting was, Sylvie thought, the most instructive part of the whole process." When it was ready, Maren handed Sylvie the bread knife, and she cut the first slice with a care that felt appropriate, and the crumb was open and irregular and slightly chewy, and the crust shattered under the knife in exactly the right way, and it was, unambiguously, bread. Her bread, made with her hands over the full length of a morning and a night, made from flour and water and a culture that was 11 years old, made slowly with patience that had been required of her, and that she had given without the resistance she might have brought to it in another life or another month. They ate it with butter and the blood orange marmalade Maren had put up in glass jars at the back of the cold pantry in January, which was dark and slightly bitter, and the most orangey tasting thing Sylvie had ever eaten, as though all the summer energy that blood oranges had stored had been concentrated in Maren's kitchen into something that released it all at once on the tongue. On the last full day, they walked together again, this time south along the coast on a path Maren knew that led through private land she had an arrangement with, and climbed above the shoulder to a headland bluff, where the view opened north and south along the coast, and the ocean was very large below, and the wind, even on a relatively calm day, had the clean, unobstructed force of something that has come a long way across open water, and has arrived without diminishment. The path moved through the shore pine, small and windswept, their growth shaped entirely by the prevailing wind, so that they all leaned east as though in agreement about something. And across low meadows of seagrass and kinnikinick, the latter bearing the small red berries still in February, very bright against the gray-green mat of the plant, and between the meadows brief strands of Sitka spruce, where the trees were shaped by the salt wind into forms that were almost architectural, each one a record of every storm it had survived. From the top of the headland they stood for a long time and looked. The coast stretched away in both directions in its gray-green and winter state, headland after headland diminishing into the distance, the ocean at each one sending its spray up in white columns that rose and fell and rose again. Small from this distance, silent like the breathing of something enormous and asleep. Farther out beyond the swells, the surface of the water was marked with the dark lines of the current moving through it. The deeper channels visible from above, the whole system of the sea briefly legible from this high and quiet place. A gray whale passed a half a mile offshore. They almost missed it. Edwin saw it first, the long, dark shape at the surface, the blow rising in a low, bushy column and drifting east in the wind, and then the back rolling clear of the water, the dorsal knuckles in a line, and then gone. They stood for several minutes afterwards, still looking at the place where it had been, as though it might come back, as though waiting was the appropriate response to having seen something that large and that unhurried pass through the world so quietly. "Ruth saw a gray whale once," Edwin said, "from a kayak. She said it went directly under her. She could see the whole length of it below the surface, and said she felt, not afraid, but very small and very honored. Those were her words, small and honored." Sylvie nodded. She understood this. The whale did not care that she was there, and this was not unkindness, but simply the natural order, and within the natural order there was something that functioned like generosity. That the whale existed at all, that it passed here, that the ocean was large enough to contain it, that she had happened to be standing on this headland at this moment with these people in this February light. The wind moved through the shore pines, and the kinnikinick lay flat and red-berried around their feet, and the ocean went about its ancient work below, and Marin stood between them, her hands in the pockets of her oilskin, and looked out at the water with an expression that was entirely settled, that had in it no longing and no regret and no weight, that was simply and completely present to what was in front of her, which was enough, which had always been enough, which she had learned long ago was everything. Edwin left first, on a morning of light rain, 3 days before Sylvie. He had stayed longer than he had planned, or than he had told himself he had planned. He had arrived staying 5 days and had, with little ceremony and no particular explanation, stayed 8. Marin had said nothing about this, had simply moved through the days of his extended stay as though it had always been the plan, which perhaps for her it had. He came downstairs with his bag, his library book, and Marin had made cinnamon rolls for his last morning, not the quick kind, but the slow kind, enriched dough left to rise overnight, filled with butter and brown sugar and cinnamon and a little cardamom, rolled and cut and left to proof again in the morning, and baked till they were dark gold on top, and their edges had merged into each other in the pan in the way that good cinnamon rolls do, forming a community of soft connected things, and the icing was cream cheese and vanilla drizzled across the warm tops so it melted immediately into the grooves of the rolls. He ate too, which surprised him and delighted him in a small way that felt like a beginning. Sylvie drank her coffee across from him, and they talked about his plans. the paper his university had been after him to write for 2 years on migratory patterns in the high desert, which he had decided to start when he got home. His daughter in Portland, whom he would stop and see on the drive south. The recipe for the braise, which Marin had written out on a piece of card in her looping cursive and tucked into his coat pocket without comment. At the door he took Sylvie's hand and held it briefly, which between two people who had known each other a week was the exact right gesture, not more, not less, carrying in it the compressed understanding of a week of shared meals and shared silences, and the particular intimacy of being vulnerable in the same place at the same time. "Take care of yourself," he said, "the way you'd take care of a patient." Sylvie nodded. She had been thinking something like this, but had not had the words for it. He said goodbye to Marin with a simplicity that was its own kind of eloquence. Just her name and a long look, and then he was walking down the porch steps into his car, and the lane took him in its alder tunnel, and the catkins shook in the light rain as he passed, and then the lane curved, and he was gone. In the 3 days she had alone, Sylvie did the things that she had been doing, and settled deeper. She walked the shore each morning, in rain and in thin winter sun, and once in a fog so thick it had reduced the world to the immediate 10 feet of beach and the sounds of waves, arriving from a direction she could feel but not see. She sat with her coffee at the inlet window and watched the light change on the water. It changed so consistently and so variously that she could have sat there all day and not run out of things to see, which she finally understood was not nothing, but was in fact the entire point. She helped Marin in the kitchen with a naturalness that by now required no negotiation, simply appearing at the counter and being given a task and doing it, in the quiet way that they had both become accustomed to, and that was not silence but its own kind of conversation. On her last evening, Marin made a dish that was so simple Sylvie would not have expected it to be the thing that undid her, slightly, in the best way. She roasted a whole chicken, rubbed it with salt and the herbs of the garden, thyme and rosemary and a little tarragon, stuffed with a half lemon and a crushed head of garlic, laid in a pan over a bed of sliced fennel and onion, and while it roasted she made nothing else, just tended the bird, basting it twice, and when it was done she lifted it from the pan and set it on the board, and made a pan sauce in the drippings, with a little white wine and the juices from the resting bird, and this sauce she drizzled over the carved pieces, and it was the simplest possible version of the best possible meal. Roast chicken on a rainy February evening, in a warm kitchen by a fire, at the end of a week that had changed something she couldn't fully name, but could feel. Roast chicken, the smell of it filling the house, the fire in the hearth, the rain on the windows, the inlet somewhere in the dark, breathing, and Marin sitting across from her, unhurried, attending. Sylvie ate and felt, quietly, without drama, that she was going to be all right, not fixed, not healed in any final sense, but altered in the direction of all right, moving toward it by some internal compass that had been recalibrated by a week of walking in the rain and sleeping in the deep bed and watching the herons and waiting for bread to be ready and putting her hand on old moss and standing on the headland in the wind above a whale-carrying sea. The compass now pointed somewhere she could follow. Her last morning she woke to the sound of rain. Of course she woke to the sound of rain. She had woken to it every morning, and she had come to love it, with a specificity she had not expected, the way it varied in intensity and rhythm, the way it sounded different on the roof than on the windows, than on the gravel of the lane, the way it was always the same and never the same, the way it kept its own counsel and did not explain itself and was simply, continuously there. She lay in the high bed and listened to it for a long time before she got up. She listened to the rain, and below the rain, the drip of the eaves, and below the drip, the faraway, continuous assurance of the ocean, which had been there every morning and would be there every morning after she left, which was not a melancholy thought, but an anchoring one. The ocean would be here, the inlet would be here, the herons would be in the shallows, Marin would be in the kitchen with her hands in something slow and good, and her attention fully given to whatever was directly in front of her, which was everything, which was the whole practice. She got up and dressed and went downstairs, and stood at the kitchen window with her coffee for a long moment, looking at the inlet in the rain, which was gray and quiet and present as it had been on the first morning, 9 days ago, when she stood in this same place with her hands around a different cup, and felt the first tentative loosening of something that had been very tight for a very long time. Marin came in from the garden. She had been out even in the rain, in her barn boots and her coat, doing something with the beds, some preparation for the slow turn that was coming through, though not yet visible. And she set her basket on the counter and saw Sylvie at the window. She came to stand by her, and they both looked at the inlet and the rain and the 2 herons on the far bank, the buffleheads still doing their cheerful diving and resurfacing, which they would apparently do forever and never stop finding worthwhile. "I don't want to leave," Sylvie said, and meant it, and also knew that leaving was what you did, and that it was what made the place mean what it meant, that it was not a place you lived in, but a place that restored you so that you could go back and live, which was different, which was its own gift. "You'll come back when you need to," Marin said, not as a sales pitch, just as a statement of what she believed to be true about how things worked. "How do you always know what someone needs?" Sylvie asked. She had been meaning to ask this for days and had kept letting the moment pass, and now the moment was nearly out of time, and she asked it. Marin looked at the inlet for a long time. The rain fell on the water and made its 10,000 circles, each one perfect and brief. "I pay attention," she said, and then, after a pause, "and I try to remember that what people need is almost always simpler than what they think they need. Rest, warmth, something good to eat, time to be somewhere without being asked to perform." She looked at Sylvie simply, directly. "You knew how to take care of yourself. You just needed somewhere that made it easy to remember." Sylvie looked at the herons. One of them lifted slowly on its great gray wings and crossed the inlet and settled on the near bank, rearranging itself to stillness in 3 exact movements, and was immediately as if it had always been there. "Thank you," she said. Marin picked up her coffee. "Drive carefully," she said, and went back to the kitchen, and the sound of something beginning on the stove came through in a moment. Oil warming in a pan, the first quiet sizzle of something being placed in it, and the house went on, as it always did, attending to whatever came next. Sylvie drove down the lane in the rain, past the alder catkins and the madrone and the gate that was always open, and she turned onto the road and the trees came in on both sides, and she drove through the February forest for a long time, with the window cracked and the cold air on her face and the smell of the coast coming in, and then gradually, mile by mile, giving way to the smell of the valley, the different rain, the different trees. But she carried something with her that did not dissipate with distance, a quality of slowness, of attention, of knowing that the next thing did not need to be begun this moment, that there was time, that she had a nature that would not abandon her, that it was waiting for her the way herons wait, the way inlets wait, the way the bread waits in its basket in the cold and in the dark, becoming slowly, more fully itself. At Heron Inlet, Marin wrote out the recipe for the braise on a second card and set it on the shelf by the door in case Edwin returned for it, or someone else needed it, or she needed to give it away. The fire burned, the rain fell on the inlet, and the inlet received it without distinction. The herons stood in the shallows in the rain and waited with their ancient and total patience for whatever the water would bring them, which it always did, which it had always done, which it would go on doing in its own time and not before. The gate was open, the kettle was on, the lane was waiting in the rain, as it always was, for whoever needed to find it next.